particular the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because we've been taking into account all of these and to provide a big overall picture of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, as we move into today's lesson, everything that we encounter in life, we know is not always a pleasant experience, right? That should not come as a shock to anyone. There are many experiences in life that we do not particularly enjoy, and some are painful. With that being said, that doesn't mean that we always seek to avoid those things. Sometimes we know that pain and struggle is necessary in order to achieve the outcome that we desire. Katie's had 2 knee replacements. Each one was a lot of pain and a lot of recovery, but if you ask her if it was worth it, she'll tell you absolutely it was. We choose to go through pain sometimes to achieve an outcome that's better than what we experience now. Life has a lot of those instances. Sometimes we choose to have a difficult and hard and painful conversation with someone because it might mend a broken relationship. It might bring us closer together. We choose to bring children into the world, even though childbearing is a painful process, and it might be argued that child rearing is even more painful than that at times. We choose, some people choose to exercise daily, even though that brings about great pain in their lives, because they know that the sweat and the effort will help them in the long run. So this morning we're going to look at the ultimate example of this principle. An example that dwarfs anything else in life that we could think of. We look at the crucifixion of Christ today. We see the Creator of all that there is allowing Himself to be beaten and ultimately killed by that which He created. And in a sense, it seems senseless. It's a great tragedy, and yet Jesus endured this willingly because He knew that all the pain was worth what He would accomplish. So open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 27. We're going to look at verses 27 through 44. And I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Some of the governor's soldiers took Jesus into their headquarters and called out the entire regiment. They stripped Him and put a scarlet robe on Him. They wove thorn branches into a crown and put it on His head. They placed a reed stick in His right hand as a scepter. Then they knelt before Him in mockery and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on Him, and they grabbed the stick and they struck Him on the head with it. When they were finally tired of mocking Him, they took off the robe and put His own clothes back on Him again, and they led Him away to be crucified. Along the way, they came across a man named Simon who was from Cyrene, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. And they went out to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. The soldiers gave Him wine mixed with bitter gall, but when He tasted it, He refused to drink it. After they had nailed Him to the cross, the soldiers gambled for His clothes by throwing dice. Then they sat around and kept guard as He hung there. A sign was fastened above Jesus' head, announcing the charge against Him. It read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 revolutionaries were crucified with Him, one on His right and one on His left. The people passing by shouted abuse, shaking their heads in mockery. "Look at you now," they yelled at Him. "You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Well then, if you are the Son of God, save yourself and come down from the cross." The leading priests, the teachers of religious law, and the elders also mocked Jesus. "He saved others," they scoffed, "but He can't save Himself. So He is the King of Israel, is He? Let Him come down from the cross right now, and we will believe in Him. He trusted God, so let God rescue Him now if He wants Him, for He said, 'I am the Son of God.'" Even the revolutionaries who were crucified with Him ridiculed Him in the same way. So last week when we finished, we saw Jesus being turned over by Pilate to be beaten and whipped and then to be led away to be crucified. Now, the scourging that Jesus underwent would have likely left him near the point of death. It was not uncommon for those who had been whipped with this instrument called the cat of nine tails, which was a leather whip that had thongs on the end of it, interwoven with pieces of metal and rock and bone. It would have left Jesus' flesh torn so badly that you could see exposed bone and cartilage and sinew. And he would have been hardly recognizable after this. And to quite literally add insult to injury, after Jesus' scourging, the Roman soldiers dressed him up as a king and pretended to worship him. They were mocking him because they didn't believe in his claim to be Messiah either. We read there that some of the governor's soldiers took Jesus to their headquarters and they called out the entire regiment. We've talked in the past about how big a regiment was. So all of these men had a hand in mocking him. They stripped him and they put a scarlet robe on him. They wove a thorn branches into a crown and they put it on his head. Now, we've looked at this in the past, it's not just a little blackberry sticker bush. These are acacia thorns, which are inches long and as hard as nails. And they put it on his head and they knelt before him in mockery. They put a reed stick in his right hand as a scepter and they taunted him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him and they took the stick away from him and they hit him on the head, driving those thorns into his scalp. And when they got tired of doing this, they took the robe off of him, they put his clothes back on him again, and they led him away to be crucified. So now Jesus standing before them, near the point of death, beaten beyond recognition, being mocked by all these men who had never even met him. After they had their fun, they got him ready to go. Though all the gospel writers record that Jesus was crucified, they don't elaborate on any of the details. The reason for that is because it was all too familiar with them, with the intended audience of the gospel writers. They knew what crucifixion was. And I'm not going to get into all the gruesome details of that today. But crucifixion was the cruelest, most brutal form of execution in the Roman world. And these were people who took great pride in their ability to torture people. And this was the cruelest form of torture. It was intended to be a spectacle, a deterrent. Jewish people were so disgusted by it that they did not allow it to happen inside their city limits. So there was this place outside of town up on the hill where the crucifixions would be held. This place outside of Jerusalem was called Golgotha, which means place or hill of the skull. It's likely had a double meaning. For one, that probably meant that from a distance this rock outcropping hill looked similar to a skull. But also it means that it's the place of execution. In Latin, the word for crucifixion is calvarium. It means skull also. It's where we get our word Calvary. So the condemned man would be led through the city on the longest possible route through there to ensure that as many people would see him. The intention was to make the condemned prisoner serve as an example and a deterrent to other would-be criminals. And they were typically required to carry their own crossbeam. Now, we see in the movies and all this where they carry the entire cross. They didn't do that. They carried the piece of the cross that's the crossbeam, the horizontal piece. It's called the paticulum. So they would carry that. It was a huge, rough-hewn piece of solid wood that weighed in excess of 100 pounds. Now, Jesus was a carpenter by trade, used to carrying large pieces of wood to do his work with. But you got to remember, he's been under an extreme amount of stress for the last 24 hours or so. He hasn't eaten, hasn't been given anything to drink. He's been beaten to within an inch of his life. So, this is the background of where we're at. So we can understand a little bit of what's going on here. And this is where Matthew takes a little side note here. He says, along the way they came across a man named Simon who was from Cyrene. And the soldiers forced him to carry the cross of Jesus. Now, I suspect that the soldiers were afraid that Jesus was going to die before they got to crucify him, before they could get to Golgotha. So they pulled somebody from the crowd to help Jesus, to carry it for him. Now, since Israel was an occupied country and Rome was in control, when a Roman soldier told you to do something, you didn't have an option. The Roman soldier had the authority, if you refused, to kill you right there. So Simon didn't have much of a choice. We don't know much about Simon. We do know that Cyrene was in North Africa, what's modern-day Libya. We don't know if Simon lived in Cyrene and was visiting Jerusalem for Passover, or whether he was simply from Cyrene but now lived in Jerusalem. But we do, using our deduction abilities, we can imagine that when Simon got up that morning, he had no intention of playing a part of anything that he ended up being involved in that day. And what's interesting is that Simon's story is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That seems like an insignificant detail, but the reason why Simon's story is recorded is, I believe, is because Simon's experience here is a picture of what Jesus had told the disciples that the Christian life was like. You remember when Jesus told his disciples, if any of you want to be my follower, what do you have to do? Give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. Simon surely would not have chosen to spend his day this way, but he was forced to carry this heavy piece of wood on a long journey through the city and outside up onto the hill of the skull. He was forced to follow behind Jesus, laboring under the weight of this heavy chunk of wood, and his clothes would have been stained with the blood of Jesus, while being taunted and ridiculed and spit upon and hit by rocks because he was with Jesus. People didn't even know Simon. Simon didn't even know Jesus, but here he is, being persecuted simply because he was associated with Christ. Is that not a picture of what Jesus said the Christian life could be? The Christian life is not an easy walk. Following Jesus will often involve suffering. It will often involve pain, and it might result in us being ridiculed by the world around us, but is it worth it? Absolutely, it is. I suspect that one day, somewhere in the distant future, that Simon became extremely grateful that he had been forced to carry the cross of Jesus. In Mark's Gospel, we are told that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, why would he say that? It seems like an odd thing to write, unless Mark expected his readers to know who these two men were. A reasonable inference is that after his experience of carrying the cross of Christ, eventually he became a believer. That this man that he met in Jerusalem that day that was beaten beyond recognition, that he carried the cross forward, was forced to watch as he was crucified, that, hey, he was the Messiah. He became a believer, and he brought his two boys, Alexander and Rufus, up to become believers, and they were baptized at a point. And as Mark writes the Gospel, Alexander and Rufus are leaders in the church. So this seemingly insignificant detail about this man, Simon of Cyrene, can actually teach us a great deal about what it means to pick up your cross and follow Jesus. It means that following Jesus is at times messy. It is hard work. It will sometimes be downright awful and painful. People might mock you. They might hate you. They might persecute you just because you are associated with Jesus. And you might find yourself exhausted in the process. But if we fix our eyes on Jesus, we will find one day that all the pain, all the struggle is worth it. And then when they finally got to Golgotha, the crucifixion begins in earnest. we read that, and they went out to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. The soldiers gave Jesus wine mixed with bitter gall, and when he tasted it, he refused to drink it. And after they nailed him to the cross, the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice, and then they sat around and kept guard as he hung there. A sign was fastened above Jesus' head announcing the charge against him. It read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on his right, one on his left. And then they began to do all this mocking. And if you said you could destroy the temple in 3 days and raise it up, well, you can't even save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from there. We'll believe in you. And even the revolutionaries who were crucified with him ridiculed him in the same way. So, Jesus is crucified between these two men that other translations calls them thieves. One translation calls them insurrectionists. The New Living Translation calls them revolutionaries. I don't believe any of those come close to what it means in the English language. It would be more, well, a better way to put it would be that they are domestic terrorists trying to overthrow, just like Barabbas. They might be guilty of murder. They might be guilty of thieving, anything in between to get their agenda carried out. So the implication to the people here is clear. Jesus is just as guilty as these terrorists are. Now, crucifixion was not only painful. I mean, imagine having these spikes driven through your wrist and through your feet, whether it's the front of the feet or the sides of the feet, to hold you to the cross. But it was a slow and agonizing way to die. Death in the crucifixion came by suffocation. As you could not breathe, your body would produce more water that would fill the pericardial sac around your heart and around your lungs, and you would eventually, in essence, you would drown. So it was agonizingly slow and painful. Each breath was excruciating painful. There was a makeshift seat on the cross, an old footrest where they were nailed to. And the seat was there not to give a person the ability to rest, but to tempt them to sit down. And when they sat down, they were in more pain because it pulled all your joints and ligaments. And then to breathe, you had to stand up on the platform and you had to push yourself up. Now remember, his back had been flogged and scourged, and the bone was exposed, and he would have to slide up the rough wood to get a breath. And then when he couldn't hold it there any longer, he had to slide back down. Sometimes crucifixion went on for days before a person died. And while Jesus was struggling simply to breathe, there's even more pain being dealt. Now we picture the cross because we see it on movies and things as Jesus was hung way up in the sky. In essence, in reality, his feet would have been about eye level with people. So all these people are walking by and they're spitting on him while this is taking place. The guards mocked him. He sees them gambling for his clothes. The Jewish leaders, it was really up close and personal, the insults that were being heaped upon him. The people in the crowd mocked him. Even the two men hanging beside him were making fun of him. And yet, when we put all the gospel accounts together, we still see a remarkable attitude in Christ. Even as he was abandoned by everyone around him and was experiencing all this unimaginable pain. Matthew tells us that he was offered this wine mixed with gall. Some speculated that this was intended to be a mild sedative or to take the edge off of the pain. Jesus refused it. He experienced every bit of what was being dealt out in full consciousness. And as he was being nailed to the cross, what does Jesus do? He asks God to forgive the hands that are holding him there and the hands that are swinging the hammer, because they don't really know what they're doing. He asked John to take care of his mother after he had died. His attitude's not one of anger and defiance, but one of grace and one of trust in God. This attitude seems to have changed not only Simon of Cyrene, but even one of the revolutionaries one of the terrorists that hung beside it. Matthew says that they both heaped insults on Jesus. But Luke's gospel tells us that at some point, one of those men had a change of heart and actually believed that Jesus really was the Son of God. And we have that famous question he asked, Jesus, will you remember me when you come into your kingdom? And Jesus didn't say, oh no, you had your chance, buddy, but you joined the bandwagon and you made fun of me. No, he said, you believe, today you will be with me in paradise. But ultimately, the greatest pain of Jesus' crucifixion was yet to come. The real point of the cross was for Christ to pay the penalty for our sin. While on the cross, the full wrath of God was poured out upon him in full measure. God the Father punished Jesus with all the punishments that was deserved for our sin. Jesus bore that punishment as he hung upon the cross. And we see and we hear his cry of agony in the words when he yells out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus knew what was happening. In fact, he was quoting from Psalm 22:1, when the people of Israel cried out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? The greatest pain that Jesus experienced didn't come from the nails. It wasn't from the whip or the crown of thorns or from the agonizing movements of trying to breathe and exhale. It wasn't the rejection of the people. His greatest pain came from being forsaken. Now, not forsaken in the way that we think forsaken. God didn't wash his hands of Jesus. He didn't turn his back on his Son. He never left him. But sin had to be paid for. And what is the penalty for sin? It's death. Now, I don't presume to fathom all of what this means, or to be able to wrap my mind around all of it, but in some way which I can't fully understand and can't fully describe, in this moment, Jesus received the wrath of God that David Bradley deserved. That every one of us deserves. And then his last words from the cross is, it is finished. Into your hands I commit my spirit. Jesus died knowing that he had accomplished his purpose, purchasing forgiveness for you and me. Now, the story of the crucifixion, even if someone did not grow up as a Christian, they're familiar with it. We have heard it every Passion Week for our entire lives that we've been in church. We know it inside and out. And the danger of knowing something, being so familiar with that, is that often we forget the significance of it. The danger is that the story stops affecting us, and we can hear it, and we can read it, and we can see it, but we can be unchanged and unmoved because of our familiarity with it. My prayer this morning is that you would not allow yourself to walk away from the cross of Jesus Christ unchanged, ever. So what do we take away? What is here for our living experience? First is that our forgiveness comes at a great cost. A lot of people don't understand why the cross is necessary. It's an overly dramatic finale to the life of Jesus. That's because they don't understand the magnitude of our sin, and they don't understand the depth of God's holiness and righteousness. God simply will not overlook our sin, folks, because he is a just judge. He is a holy God. He cannot allow evil to go unpunished and unchecked. In order for him to offer us forgiveness, our penalty for our sin still has to be paid and still has to be borne by someone. The wrath of the holy God must be dealt out somehow. Jesus made it possible for us to be forgiven because he bore that wrath. He bore the penalty of our sin on the cross. God punished him instead of you. And in doing so, he offers you the chance to be forgiven. Jesus tells us that if we will seek him and follow him, then we will be forgiven. No matter what you've done, no matter how bad you think you are, if you'll trust in what Christ did for you on the cross and follow him as Lord and Savior, you can rest assured that your sin has been dealt with. Your account, your sin debt account reads paid in full because Jesus took God's wrath for your sin in your place. And he proclaimed, "It is finished." That is the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is finished. There's nothing left to be paid. We must never scoff at such an amazing gift. It came at a great cost. And we'll be fools to leave such an offer on the table. Secondly, we see the great love that Christ has for us. Sometimes people ask God, why would he allow any of this to happen? They see it as a great tragedy, that the greatest tragedy that's ever occurred, and it is. But there's one word that gives us the cause, the reason for that, and it's love. God loved you enough to make a way. Jesus loved you enough to bear the penalty for your sin and self. So we cannot look at the cross. We cannot encounter the cross and be unmoved. When you come to the cross, remember the reason that Jesus stayed there. The reason that he went there was his great love for you. Your sin made it necessary for Christ to die. Because the evil things that you and I have done, Jesus had to be punished. But you can also see that he did all of that willingly because he loved you so much. As we look at the cross, we should see our sin. But we should also see that our sin is overshadowed by the love of Christ. Third, we're reminded of what true love and forgiveness really looks like. He shows us that love is possible. To overlook a fault of someone else, to extend forgiveness rather than retribution is to care for another when they don't care for you. It's hard. It's tough work. It costs us a great deal to do those things sometimes. But Jesus demonstrates true love at the cross. And when we see his act of love played out, it should enable us to more readily love and forgive others in the same way. And then lastly, just like we started our time in our lesson here, we see that the Christian life is sometimes painful, but it's worth it. As we look at the example of Simon of Cyrene, we remember that it's not always easy to follow Jesus. And it will cost us a great deal. I imagine that Simon probably was repelled when he first felt Jesus' blood from the cross on his own skin. But then at some point in his life, I imagine he remembered what that blood felt like. Folks, if you are living the Christian life and you never had the blood of Christ on your heart, on your life, then you are not living the Christian life. It's painful sometimes. It's hard sometimes. Sometimes we're tempted to give up. Sometimes we feel like we just can't go on. Sometimes we remember all the bad things. And we remember that road that Jesus went, the path that he took led to the cross, the place where our forgiveness and love is found. And we remember, the Christian life is not easy, but thank God through the precious blood of our Savior, it is worth it. It is worth it. We must take up our cross and follow Christ daily. As you think about the crucifixion, if you're like me, you're filled with a lot of different emotions. Anger, guilt, shame, sorrow, but also at the same time, joy and wonder and gratitude of a great love that we can never fathom the depth of. That is the power of the cross, folks. Jesus endured the cross for one simple reason. He knew it would be worth it. He knew what it would accomplish. And he looked somehow, as only God can, through the years. And he saw what your life was supposed to be. And he deemed each and every one of you worth it. Praise God. Let's stand and sing our closing hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross.